noon. So continuing with the agenda, we have item number 8, Gulf of Mexico Ecosystem Service Logic Models and Socioeconomic Indicator, also known as GEMS. So we have Lydia Olander, Dr. Lydia Olander, all the way from Durham, presenting to us. The purpose is to present outcomes from recently developed Gulf of Mexico Ecosystem Service Logic Models and Socioeconomic Indicators. These are GEMS. And the comprehensive plan connection, it supports PE 4.1, provide regular updates showcasing use of the best available science to reinforce the relationship between land use, environment, and community. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Olander.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me join you today. I look forward to talking to you about the project. So the project is for the entire Gulf of Mexico, but I think there could be applications for your region and for the CHNEP, so it'd be great to get some discussion of that at the end if people are interested. Next slide. So GEMS is just shorthand for our project name, but the project purpose is really to link restoration project impacts to economic health and well-being benefits for people. And the team consists of researchers from the Hart Research Institute, the Gulf of Mexico, from Texas A&M, from Duke University and the National Ecosystem Services Partnership, and from the Nature Conservancy, including, I think, your next speaker, Chris Shepard, and the Bridge Collaborative. Next slide. So, as you all know, there's a resources being spent in the Gulf of Mexico to conduct restoration in response to the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And the National Academies has been deeply involved in trying to think about how to do that in the best way possible. And one of the things they pushed for in a number of their reports was the need to develop clear and measurable ecological and, where appropriate, socioeconomic objectives at project and program levels to guide monitoring plans and against which to evaluate restoration progress. So that's squarely where our project fits. It's trying to help with that second piece, the socioeconomic objectives. Next slide, please. So the challenge we're trying to address is that with all this money being spent on restoration in the Gulf, there's still no shared approach or platform to guide assessment and reporting of how restoration is achieving a broad set of social and economic goals that are shared by many institutions working in the Gulf. And so these are just as an example from the Restore Council, and you can see community resilience and economic revitalization are two of their goals, and they're very much tied to social and economic outcomes, but at this point we don't really have a way to assess and track those in projects and programs very effectively. Next slide, please. So we're hoping to lay the groundwork for such a shared platform that could be used by program managers, restoration funders. We have a number of these funders involved in kind of designing our project. So the Restore Council, someone attached to the NERDA process, state resource agencies, and NIFWIF all are kind of helping us think through how best to make this a useful product for all of them and the programs that they work with. And funding for the project is coming from the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. Next slide, please. So our approach has been to develop a set of what we call evidence-based logic models that follow from a restoration or project intervention all the way through to the social and economic outcomes that are related to it. And we use these kind of models to help us understand the systems we're working in and make sure that's transparent and clear, and to select outcomes that need metrics. And so this is a really easy example from oyster intervention, some kind of oyster reef project. There's a bunch of biophysical and ecological changes that happen in the system, and those lead to changes in how humans interact with those systems, in this case, recreational non-oyster harvest, so fish that are associated with these reefs. And that leads to changes in jobs and recreation. So that's just an example of how we're trying to push this all the way to understand the social and economic outcomes. Next slide. And then from there, we think about what is a tractable set of social and economic metrics that can be relevant across different project types, whether it's oyster reefs or a water quality enhancement project for a treatment plant. across different kinds of funding programs and locations. And so the idea is that these can help facilitate effective project planning, evaluation, and comparison for these social and economic outcomes. Next slide. So we're hoping this will allow funders and project planning managers to compare restoration approaches across a broader suite of shared goals, so they can understand how different restoration approaches achieve different social and economic outcomes. Second, to identify uncertainties and gaps in our knowledge about these social and economic outcomes. So looking at these models helps us understand, and developing these models, talking to experts, reading the literature helps us understand what we know and what we don't know about how restoration is affecting these social and economic outcomes. And that can inform our monitoring plans as well. And third, to track performance towards social and economic goals and report on that. Next slide. So what I'm going to walk through now is really kind of just one example of this. Our first phase was really a deep dive into oyster reef restoration. And since then, we have replicated this process and sped it up for a whole suite of restoration type activities that are happening in the Gulf of Mexico. So I'll use this as an example, and then I'll show you the full list of projects we've included in addition to oyster reef restoration. So we did a series of workshops, outreach with experts, practitioners, stakeholders, significant literature reviews. We developed these logic models for all different types of oyster reef interventions, so everything from a culture plant to a complex subtidal reef to aquaculture. And we make sure we understand the social and economic outcomes of these different things. And then we worked with these groups to understand what kinds of metrics might be feasible for these social and economic outcomes, what data was available, what would work at a project scale, what would work on a program scale. Next slide, please. And so we did a series of workshops and work groups across one in each state, focusing on a specific estuary, just as an example, to think through how these metrics would work on a project or estuary scale. And then we also did a regional workshop where we brought some of those people together with other experts across the region to understand how this would work on a programmatic scale. Okay, next slide. So this is an example of one of these models, and you can find these all online. I'll show you in just a moment. So this is an oyster reef restoration, and this is what I call the general or generic model. So every type of oyster reef restoration I mentioned are all folded into this model. And so if you're doing a culture plant, some of these pathways and boxes will fall away. For example, a culture plant will not have an impact on shoreline protection, but a living shoreline that uses oysters would. So this one has everything in it, and they'll be simplified as you try some of the different types of oyster reef restoration. And so all those variations are available on our website. And this model shows the different human activities we see associated with these oyster reefs, everything from commercial and non-commercial activities associated with oysters and fish associated with these reefs, to recreational activities, educational activities, etc. And those lead to these yellow boxes, which are the social economic outcomes, which move from infrastructure to human health to economic activity measures, most of which were talked about with the last presentation, and also cultural values, which can vary significantly across sites. And then the other thing I want to note is community resilience is a key goal for Restore Council and for others. And since so many different aspects of the social and economic system contribute to community resilience, what we've done is we've kind of flagged which of these outcomes seem most tightly tied to community resilience, so that people can understand, what they would need to look at if they want to understand how their project is contributing to community resilience. And the other thing we're doing right now is we're developing measurement protocols, which I'll talk about more in a moment, for these different metrics. And we're incorporating approaches for understanding the equity and distributional aspects of those different measures and metrics, so that you could get at equity in measuring these outcomes as well. Next slide. So this is just a snapshot from our website. So all of the models we've developed are available on our website, and you can download the static image of the model. You can also download an editable version of the model. And the idea here is these are generic models, and they have to be adapted to your context and your project. And so those are all editable. There's a little video on how to edit them. And so that makes them useful and usable to others. And then there's a context document that explains why certain things are in or not in those models. You might be looking for something that's not there, and those documents will explain why the model's done the way it is, and also talk about who the experts are and what references were used in developing them. One other thing we've done is for oyster reef in particular, we did a really deep dive on the literature and did a full evidence library for every arrow in that model. We assessed what we knew and didn't know about that system, and that's available as an evidence library on our website as well. Next slide. So just quickly for the evidence libraries, we have one for salt marsh as well, but that was done nationally, not just for the Gulf of Mexico. These are all evidence for every pathway. We try to understand the strength of evidence for each pathway, what other factors affect those pathways that can influence the relationship to the outcomes, and how predictable those relationships are. And we want to confirm that these outcomes are tightly tied to the intervention, the oyster reef restoration in this case, identify which pathways are most important for these outcomes, and understand our gaps in knowledge. Next slide. Just a quick snapshot. I know this is crazy to look at, but that's from the evidence library, and each of the colors show you a different kind of strength of evidence. So those that are purple have low or no evidence, and those that are green have strong evidence, and yellow's in between. So it gives you a sense of kind of the knowledge gaps for the system. Next slide. So for the metrics, we did a literature review first and identified metrics that are being used in other places from other protocols and guidances that are out there, as well as peer-reviewed literature, and just got ourselves a first set of metrics to then bring to the groups, the workshops that I talked about. This is examples of some of those resources. Next slide. So when we work with the groups, we asked them to think about a number of different things for metrics. We wanted them to be meet the SMART criteria here, and we had kind of key things we talked about feasibility, whether data was available, could projects do this, would this be something that could fold into things they're already measuring, or would it require additional expertise or capacity? We also wanted to understand the spatial scale. Is this something you would measure at a project scale, or would it require looking at a program scale where you had cumulative effects across multiple projects to actually see the effect or measure the effect given the data? So we use this as the basis for asking a bunch of questions about the metrics to try to get to something that was useful and feasible. Next step, next slide. So what we ended up with was this kind of matrix where we have metrics that are either at the program scale or at the project scale, and sometimes both for each of these outcomes. And sometimes we have tier 1 or tier 2 ones, some that we think are relatively feasible and easy to do, and those that would be nice to have but would be a bit harder to measure. And then the CR, which looks a little funny on these slides, but that's the community resilience. So we've kind of noted where an outcome or a metric is tied to community resilience. Next slide. So this is for oysters, just to give some examples here. So this is the economic activity measures. And we think there are some things you can do pretty easily at the project scale, just pulling from existing resources like restoration expenditures or aquaculture restoration jobs that are folded into project documents. Tier 2, there may be ways to calculate some of the recreational fishing jobs and fishing expenditures. That's a little more difficult, but there are methodologies to do it, and people have done it. So for example, at Half Moon Reef, some of these methods were used. But then at the program scale, you need methods like those that were just talked about by Courtney, some of these modeled measures to look at cumulative impacts. And so you would take some of the in-plan type modeling she did and correlate it with where restoration projects are on the ground and understand how restoration is influencing these different economic outcomes. So that would have to be done at a much larger scale to measure. Next slide. And so this is for public infrastructure protection. At this point, we have some tier 2 measures for how you can look at how reduced erosion of the shoreline might affect property. So that's an example there. That's only one we were able to find that was feasible there. Next slide. And then for cultural values, these all require some additional work. And so they're tier 2. They're tied to gaining knowledge about the system. So like you can have surveys of activities of people visiting sites, for example, that you could build on. And then for cultural values, these are very community specific. And so we actually suggest a process here that our workshop community helped us develop, where you would actually work before you put a project in the ground with a community to identify what cultural values are most important to them and how to measure them, and then integrate that into whatever monitoring system you're putting in place. Next slide. There are some for oyster reefs that we couldn't do. So mental health, nutrition for communities, and physical health, we could not come up with data and that was sufficient, or approaches that were sufficient to come up with metrics. And partially that was just because the oyster reef impact might not be that large on some of these outcomes, but also because the way data is collected, it's aggregated at a state scale, it's sampling data, it's not going to be feasible for looking at restoration projects. Next slide. So when we think about equity for these, we are doing looking at equity in a few different ways. So we're trying to understand, are the services that are being provided by the intervention available to all, and will they continue to be accessible to all? We want to know how the benefits are distributed across communities of concern and underrepresented groups, and are the disservices or trade-offs the same for all communities, or is there more burden placed on socially vulnerable communities? So we're embedding methodologies for tracking these kinds of things. Some boxes there are examples of the kinds of tools that are used currently that we can integrate these methods into and incorporate into measurement. Next slide. So the measurement protocols we're developing, we have a suite of them that are being at the project scale that'll be coming out at some point along with the rest of our materials here. They include using existing project data, existing data sets, spatial analysis, and social surveys, or hopefully building on surveys that are already being done by sites and programs. And then there's these equity methods I just talked about. And then at the program scale, we're in the process now of developing kind of a proposal for how we could develop some of the economic analysis and social data collection at more of a regional scale for programmatic measurements. Next slide. So for phase 2, this is the list of projects we did. So when we finished the oyster reef piece of this, we talked to our advisory council and they said, that's great, can you now do that for everything else we fund? And so we did our best talking to the funders to come up with a set of types of projects that are funded commonly across the full Gulf, and then to try to develop the same thing, these models and metrics for all of these types of projects. So this process is almost complete now. Most of this is on our website. We have models for all of these systems available. We're just adding agricultural BMPs. And the metrics are out for most of these already on our website, and we're still working on the methodologies. So we have all different kinds of habitat restoration, beaches, mangrove, salt marsh, seagrass within shorelines. In addition to the oyster reefs, we have reconnecting hydrological flows. We have various different recreational enhancement projects. And then we spent a lot of time focusing on the water quality enhancement projects in our second phase, because those are most different from the habitat restoration and require different sets of experts, have a different suite of outcomes. So these are everything from stormwater management, gray and green, to septic to sewer conversions, to wastewater treatment plant upgrades. And we're adding agricultural BMPs right now. Next slide. So we're in the process now of trying to figure out how to share all this information and make it useful to others. And so if you have thoughts on this, we'd greatly appreciate it. We are developing at this point some short guides to provide kind of an overview that explains the models and the metrics, and to guide users to our website. And we're trying to develop these with the idea this is kind of for practitioners to use at this point. So we have guides that explain how practitioners can use this information in developing proposals or monitoring plans for their projects. And so we'll kind of do them by by group. So we'll have oyster reef restoration one. We're planning to probably have one on other habitat restoration, and maybe then one on recreational projects, for example. And then the website is under development still, but a lot of this material is on a website that is currently being adapted, and where hopefully you can find all of this information easily. And we see the kind of users of this. Oh, one more thing. And we're also going to do a funders guide, so funders can, how funders might use this data. And so the idea is that project developers will hopefully use this to help tell the story of the restoration project, so they can show how the restoration projects are helping to achieve social and economic outcomes. We're hoping that funders might use this to help guide funding calls, so they can better match their funding calls with the restoration goals that they have, the social and economic goals they're trying to achieve. And then we think both funders and project developers might use this to help select some socioeconomic metrics that are relevant to their projects or programs for monitoring and reporting moving forward. Next slide. So we're finishing up this project, hopefully spring of this coming year. So we're getting pretty close to the end, and all of the resources will be available online. We're hoping to go on a tour of the Gulf states and talk to the funders in the region as state agencies, communities like yours, to kind of get the information out on this, but also try to figure out how to make it more useful and accessible to the communities involved. And then next steps, we're trying to figure out how we might pilot test some of these metrics and measurement protocols in different places. We also would like to move forward to develop some of the methods and kind of actually do the analysis for some of the regional scale economics and social methods to get at the program scale measures, the cumulative effects. And then hopefully work with other communities in the Gulf to build a system so that these are kind of repeated measures, that so you can get trends over time of programmatic impact of these restoration resources that are being spent across the Gulf. Next slide. So just in terms of applying it in a place like the CHNEP, we think and we hope that these logic models could help groups identify and consider the potential social and economic outcomes of restoration plans and projects they're considering. Also to help them think about the critical beneficiaries and stakeholders that will be affected by these projects and plans, and think about the equity issues. So by looking at these conceptual models, these logic models we've developed, it helps identify what the outcomes are. And from there, you can think about, well, who's going to be affected by all of these outcomes? And you can even tie that to some community mapping exercises. And then for metrics, we're hoping that we might be able to pilot test some of these metrics, or at least help groups think about what metrics they might incorporate into their programs to help them understand the social and economic outcomes that they're having with their programs. And also to start the conversation about cultural values and whether there's anything in particular that certain communities might want to track and measure that's important to them, that might be specific to them. So those might be worth talking about a little bit if people are interested after the presentation as well. Next slide. So our website information is there. You can find all of this on our website. The website's still being adapted a lot these days. We're working on making it more accessible and easy to use. And there's my contact information if you have questions. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And Chris Shepard's, if she's on the line as well, might be able to jump in as well.
Justin, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Lydia and Jennifer also. Fantastic presentation. Do we have any questions from members for Lydia?
I don't mind jumping in with a question, actually. So are you looking for partners in this area for those test projects, those pilot projects like you were talking about, where you could actually see, where you'd actually be measuring results from specific restorations?
Yeah, so we're just talking about that, about putting together a proposal to some of the funders in the region to develop some pilot projects working from this. So I think we're just starting to think about it, but we would like to have those conversations when we do our tour of the Gulf, as we're calling it, to reach out and think about next steps. So yeah, we'd love to talk more about that.
Great. We'd be interested in hearing, or maybe leading you to some resources for that in our area as well.
That'd be fantastic. So maybe follow up by email if you want. I would love to talk more.
I have a question too, Lydia. So yeah, I think it's fantastic. I mean, I'm no economist, but I definitely, noticed that homes are much more valuable when they're around restored or preserved or conserved natural areas, especially in this part of the Gulf of Mexico rim. I don't know, maybe that's happening also in other areas, but I can definitely see where just in terms of the hedonic value that Courtney was talking about, when you have these natural areas that are buffering, it brings up property values, and so restoration is definitely, there's a connection. So going to your oyster reef restoration example that you showed a lot with, and I know you're talking about the overview and you're using that as an example. Just specifically because this is the home also. We do, our firm does the lion's share of oyster reef restoration and shoreline restoration in the Tampa Bay region. And when I was looking at that last map that you had up there, a lot of the red areas, we do a tremendous amount of, we're actually doing the project selection. We're helping with finding the funders like SwiftMud and the state, the NEPs, and actually designing and building the restoration. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. And I can just think of one specific example that was in red on your map, and that's the Apollo Beach oyster reef restoration. That if you look at it over time, again, I'm not an economist and I can't trace it, but you can see that the shoreline was eroding. There's a major problem with that infrastructure. We put together we implemented the restoration, did the restoration. The shoreline's fantastic, and those property values have really gone up. And this is in Apollo Beach in Tampa Bay. So I don't know if you can directly link the restoration to the property values going up, because there's a lot of other things going on at the same time. But I can just see that as part of it. And so when I was just looking at your logic model, that shoreline restoration didn't necessarily go into the economic valuation, because home prices going up is direct money in people's pockets, really. So I'm just wondering, just thinking a little critically about that, whether or not that's a separate endpoint, or whether or not that shoreline restoration goes into an economic valuation endpoint. But that's all I have.
No, great question. So I think for oyster reef restoration, so many of the different kinds of oyster reefs don't have a direct impact on property, but the living shorelines could potentially do that. And I think in the experts we talked to, they thought that wasn't likely to be a common or major outcome from oyster reef restoration. For some of the other habitats, it definitely is in our models explicitly. And we have metrics for that, but of course their hedonic pricing is a tier 2 because it requires some expertise. So I think in this case, it's something, maybe we could talk to you, maybe there's enough examples of it that we should include it in our general model, but it's also something that you could take our general model and add it in for your project if you think it's relevant. You can see how we have it in some of our other models. And you can explain like why things are not included in those context documents, kind of the input we got that had us either include or not include certain things like that.
Yeah, I'll take a look at your library, and I guess I saw it was like number 9, and it was green and number 9. I'll just take a look at it and see, because Tampa Bay is just going crazy with oyster reef restoration. There's so much going on. It's a lot. People really are buying into it, and the homeowners are seeing the values go up when you have it in front of them. So I think it's a good case study.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, this is Jennifer. I just say likewise, the Caloosahatchee River a little further south in Southwest Florida, they're doing just, extensive acres and acres of seagrass restoration and replanting. So that would be also a really, I know some of the people involved, like David Seeley, are on this call right now. So again, if you're looking for case studies or things to knit into, I think we have a plethora of restoration projects that would fit really well with what you're doing.
Okay, that's fantastic. We'll have to follow up on that.
Any other questions from members for Lydia? Hey, Lydia, thank you. Just a real quick one is Nicholas Institute. That's not the Nicholas School of the Environment. Are those two separate things? I'm confused a little.
Yeah, they same donor, different things. Yeah, we're a policy institute associated with the school, well, with the university. But I'm an adjunct professor at the school as well, so I associate with both.
Okay, great. Okay, good. So the institute is not an educational; it's a policy institute for where you have academics working. Gotcha. Okay.
It's a think and do tank that works across the entire university, so not just within the school. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Well, yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much. There's no action needed. It's for information and discussion only. So with that, I think we can move on.